mean, the vibe for me is just pilgrim fashion, but make it 2024 and Scandinavian cute. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel and welcome back to a brand new sewing tutorial. I am very excited about this one, and it's actually a sewing tutorial that has been requested by a lot of you after I shared my Christmas pajamas that I made in December. Also, if you are brand new to my channel, welcome. My name is Madison. I was a high school fashion design teacher for 4 years. I've been sewing since I was 8 years old. I actually did the math the other day and realized that I've actually been sewing for 20 years, which it's crazy, but I am so passionate about sharing my love and passion for fashion and sewing with all of you. And so my goal is to take all of the things that I used to do in the classroom with my students and share it in a virtual space here on YouTube and TikTok and Instagram to inspire you in your creativity and grow your sewing skills so that you can start to become an expert sewist. In today's video, we are going to be making a fabulously chic, giant Scandi colored blouse, and I am so excited about this. Throughout the course of last year, I started to notice large collars kind of becoming more of a thing. Actually, go back all the way to like 2022. I started to notice them. I think that they really picked up last year. It's probably a trend that's going to kind of just fizzle out and not really become as much of a thing in 2024, but also I feel like there are so many people who are just like not caring as much about what the trends are, have discovered their kind of style aesthetic and are going to stick with that because they love it. And I feel like that's kind of the journey that I've personally been on and why I just love collared shirts. I'm obviously wearing one right now. The one that we are making today is even larger and more fabulous and amazing than this, and so I am excited about sharing that project with you all in today's video. There have been so many just cute outfits kind of centered around this kind of idea of oversized fashion, but also playing with proportions, and I just have always loved this idea of proportions in fashion, and I feel like when you add a collar to a shirt, you start to play with proportions, and if that is a large oversized collar, you definitely are playing with some really fun proportions. It obviously is not a style that's for everyone, but I personally love it, and I think you can mix it and match it and style it in so many different ways. So that's what we're going to be doing in today's videos. I'm going to be walking you through step by step how you can make your own. And the great thing about this specific blouse is that I'm actually using a store-bought pattern. So no pattern making. You don't have to figure out how to make the pattern for this top. You can go out and get the pattern for yourself, come to this tutorial, go through it, and make your own. The pattern that we are using for this shirt is the Butterick B6895. I picked this up in December because I wanted a large collared blouse. There's another pattern, I think that's McCall's, that is very similar, but I personally really love how this one sewed up. And so there are 3 different color options. We are going to be making option B, which is the larger collar with ruffles. I'm actually going to be adapting the sleeves of this pattern because this pattern only has short sleeves and like mid-arm sleeves. So I'm going to be showing you how you can lengthen the sleeve to make it a long sleeve if you want. And it's going to be so much fun. I'm going to be using this gray fabric that's actually the back side of a duvet that I thrifted. I thrifted it because one side was this white and light gray mini striped fabric that I used to make my Scandinavian pajama pants, which are literally my favorite pair of pants, and I'm excited to now make a large oversized collared blouse. I call it like a Scandi blouse because if you're familiar with Scandinavian fashion, it very much plays into proportions. It's like laid back chic, but it draws a lot of inspiration also, I feel like, from historical silhouettes, and I think that's where the collars kind of come into play. It reminds me of Pilgrims, but like 2024 cute. Anyways, I decided to use this gray because I need more like solid color blouses in my closet to kind of mix and match and style in different ways. So I'm excited to have a solid color. Also, I think that making the blouse out of this will just pair really cute with my Scandinavian pants. So we're going to be using this fabric and this pattern. All of the details for this will be down in the description of this video. So let's dive in and learn how to make the most perfect oversized collared blouse.
The first thing you're going to want to do is remove all of your tissue paper pattern pieces from your pattern envelope. You're going to want to look at the pattern directions and identify the style that you are going to be making, and then cut out the specific pattern pieces that go along with that style. If you need to know how to read an actual store-bought pattern, I do have a video on my channel that takes you through all of the steps so that you can become very confident with how to read a pattern and figure out what pieces you need, layout instructions, all of those things. These are all of the pattern pieces that we are going to be using for this specific blouse. So we are going to be using all of the pattern pieces for style B, but we are going to grab the sleeves from style A. Once all your pattern pieces are cut out, it's time to start laying them out on our fabric. When it comes to laying out the pattern pieces for the specific blouse, you want to make sure and pay attention to the directions and the layout instructions in the actual pattern. It will kind of show you how to fold your fabric, how to lay out your different pattern pieces to maximize the space of your fabric. I tend to come up with my own pattern layouts only because I'm using fabric that's a different width than typical store-bought fabric, but this is how I am doing it. You also want to pay attention to the number of cuts you need to make of certain pieces. Certain pieces you're going to have to cut out 2 times or 3 times, so pay attention to that because you will have to repin them and recut them. And now we're just going to cut out all of our pattern pieces. As you are cutting out these pattern pieces, keep in mind what size you are going to be sewing so that you cut your pattern piece at the size line that you choose. Also make sure that you're cutting out the notches. Your back pieces are going to have double notches and your front pieces are going to have single notches. This is going to come in handy when you are matching up your collar pieces and your front bodice to your back bodice. So just pay attention to all of your pattern markings, and your pattern directions will actually explain to you what all the different markings are. And here's where we divert a little bit from the original directions. So remember how I said that we are going to steal the sleeves from style A? Well, this is the sleeve piece, and it's actually like a mid sleeve where it ends at the elbow, but we want it to be a long sleeve. So I just measured from the top of my shoulder down to my wrist. I pinned where that extended length is going to be. I draw a line for the extended bottom of my sleeve, and then I'm just going to draw straight lines from the top underarm of my sleeve pattern. And this is literally how we adjust the length and the width of a sleeve pattern that already exists. Super duper easy. Then we're just going to cut out that new shape. Once all of our pattern pieces are cut out, we then need to transfer any pattern markings. There's a pattern marking at the back of the bodice. This is going to be for the pleat. We also are going to have front dart. So we are just going to transfer any markings that are on our tissue paper pattern onto our fabric so that we know where to pin our fabric together and sew it. The darts on this bodice and any bodice are especially important because this is going to help the bodice or any item of clothing really fit to the curves of your body. So correctly transferring the dart pattern markings is going to be important and also help you correctly sew those darts together. And now it's time to start sewing. This is where referencing the pattern directions is going to be helpful because you have illustrations and you have written out pattern directions. The first step in constructing this bodice is going to be to mark up the dots that we transferred onto our fabric for that back little pleat of our bodice. We're just going to pin those together and then we're going to do a little stitch along the top. We do that because it's going to help narrow the back bodice so that we can sew the yoke onto it. We also want to match up and pin together our front bodice darts. You're just going to match up the lines that you drew onto your fabric for your dart placement, pin those together, and we're going to sew it together from widest to narrowest. When it comes to sewing darts, you always want to sew your darts from the widest end to the narrowest end. The narrowest end is essentially where you're kind of sewing off the edge of your fabric to create this really nice and distinct point for your dart. And this is what our darts look like after they're sewn. At this point, we want to make sure that we take our garment pieces over to our iron and we're going to press our darts down towards the bottom of our bodice to make them all nice and flat. And this is what they look like after they're pressed. This is also what the pleat on the back of our bodice looks like. This is going to kind of help the back of our bodice have a little bit more flowiness and ease, and we are then going to attach the back of our bodice to the top portion of our yoke. As you can see, we have some notches. All we're going to do is match those notches up together with our fabric right sides together. We're going to pin across that straight edge, and then we're going to sew that on 5/8 inch seam allowance. After we have sewn the yoke piece onto the back of our bodice, we want to press that seam allowance up towards the top of our shoulders. Then we're going to flip it around so that the right side is facing us. Now we are going to attach the two front bodice pieces. We are going to do this by matching up the shoulders with the notches and the side seams with their notches. Make sure that you are placing these right sides together. Once we have pinned our front bodice pieces to our back bodice piece, we are then just going to sew our shoulder seams and our side seams, and this is all going to be done at 5/8 inch seam allowance. After I sewed all those seams, I also took them over to my serger to finish my seams with an overlocking stitch. If you don't have a serger, you can also finish these seams with different seam finishes. And here's what all of those seams look like sewn and finished. Now it's time to work on the collar. Now the collar is made up of 2 fabric pieces and 1 interfacing piece. I had to make sure I cut my fusible interfacing piece because I forgot that originally. This fusible interfacing piece is going to get pressed and attached and bonded to one of those fabric pieces, and that's going to become the underside of our collar that has some stability. The first step of our collar is to fuse and attach our interfacing to one of our fabric pieces. We're going to do this by fusing the glue side of our interfacing to the wrong side of one of our fabric collar pieces, and then we are still going to have a regular fabric collar piece. We're going to set those aside though, and we are going to work on the ruffles for this collar. You have 3 long strips of fabric that we are going to be using for our ruffles. So first we have to attach and sew those together. And then after those are sewn together to make a really long strip, we are going to fold one of the raw edges under 2 times at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance and hem it. So as you can see, I'm using my seam gauge. I'm just folding that raw edge up 1/4 of an inch, pressing it, and then I'm going to fold it up one more time, press it again, and hem it. After I folded up my edges, I also inserted pins to make sure that that hem didn't shift or move, and then the raw edges on the ends of this ruffle piece I'm also going to fold up 2 times, press, and stitch. And now we're going to take that long ruffle piece over to our sewing machine and stitch down our narrow hem. I first started at my edge, pivot, and then sew down the really long edge of my ruffle. After it's hemmed, it's now time to place my basting stitches at the top raw edge of this long ruffle piece. Our basting stitches are going to allow us to gather our ruffle together. I like to use 2 rows of basting stitches, one at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance and one at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, leaving tails. Then we're going to tie our top tails together and our back tails together, and using those 2 top tails that are tied together, we're just going to pull it to create and bunch up our ruffles. If you want to know how to learn gathering, I do have a video on my channel that walks you through all the different ways that you can gather. After our ruffle is gathered together and I make sure that it fits around the entire outside edge of my collar, we're going to sandwich the ruffle pieces into the middle of our 2 collar pieces. So the right side of our ruffle is going to be facing the right side of our regular fabric collar piece, and the interfacing collar piece is going to be sandwiched on top of that with its right side on the inside. So we're going to have 3 layers at the end of this. You can baste your gathered ruffle first before you pin these all together, but I usually just kind of skip that step and sandwich them all at once. And then we're going to stitch all the way around the edge so that our nice, cute ruffles are held in place. Taking our collar over to our sewing machine, we are going to sew through all of those ruffles, and keep in mind that your collar is curved, so as you are sewing, pay attention to where your seam allowance line is so that as you are shifting and moving the curve of your collar, you're still sewing the correct seam allowance. Before we flip our collar right side out, we are going to go in and clip along those curves. So just using the tip of our scissors, we're going to put little clips or snips about 1 inch apart. This is going to help our collar lay really nice and flat along the curves. So then we are going to flip it right side out, and you can see all of those cute little ruffles. After it's flipped right side out, make sure that you take it over to your iron and give it a nice press. And now it's time to attach our collar to our neckline. We are going to attach our collar to our neckline by paying attention to the notches on the collar. The notches on the collar should match up with the notches on the neckline, helping you correctly pin your collar all the way around your curved neckline. You also want to make sure that your ruffles and your collar are right side facing you. And as we do so, we're just going to continue pivoting our collar around the curve of our neckline, paying attention to those notches. We are going to be stitching the collar onto the bodice before we add any of the interfacing and lining pieces. This is going to help the collar not shift as we're working with it. So now that our collar is attached, it's now time to sew in our lining pieces and our interfacing pieces. To create the lining and interfacing pieces, you are going to need the second cut of your yoke piece and your 2 front bodice interfacing pieces. These are going to be the long strips. You're going to match the top of those with the top shoulder edge of your yoke pieces and pin them together. Then you're going to take those over to your sewing machine and sew them on 5/8 inch seam allowance. Once they are sewn, you're going to want to press them open at your iron. While you are at your iron, you are also going to want to fold up the bottom edge of your yoke piece. You can fold this up 1/2 inch. You can also use your seam gauge to help make sure that you accurately fold it and press it 1/2 inch. And this is what those 2 pieces look like sewn together and pressed.
Alright, so we have the interfacing pieces. This is like the back yoke. That is kind of the lining for what is already on the inside. And then these long pieces are going to be the interfacing for the front opening of the shirt. In the actual pattern directions, they have you cut out fusible or sew on interfacing for these pieces, and you can see that in the directions because it's the dotted illustration. I opted not to put interfacing on these pieces only because I didn't want my button areas and plackets and buttonholes to be quite as stiff. So I'm just going to be using the regular fabric. I also decided to serge the edges that are going to be exposed on the inside of the bodice instead of folding in the edges and stitching them down. That is what the original directions say. So you have a couple of different options on how you want to go about that. I just decided to serge it and not do the interfacing.
Similarly to how we pinned our collar, we are going to pin our lining pieces the same way, matching up the notches around our neckline, pinning around our neckline, and then pinning down the front of our bodice. Make sure that as you are pinning these lining pieces, they are right side together with the outside right side of your bodice. After you pin the lining around the neckline, you are also going to pin down the front of your bodice for those interfacing pieces. And then we are going to sew it at our sewing machine. Using 5/8 inch seam allowance, we are going to start at the bottom interfacing. We are going to do a little stitch, and then we're going to pivot at the bottom corner of our bodice, and then continue sewing up that straight edge all the way till we get to the neckline. Same thing in our neckline, we're going to pivot at any corners and then sew around our curves. While I'm at my sewing machine, I'm also going to top stitch along the back yoke on the right side. So we are top stitching over this so that it attaches to the inside lining of our yoke. This is going to be sewn over that bottom edge that we folded up. We're also going to do the same thing at our shoulders. We're going to top stitch along our shoulder seam so that it attaches to the inside lining at the shoulder and at the edge that you folded under. Here's a closer look of the top stitch along the shoulder. At this point, I also decided to sew in my clothing label into the back top of my bodice since I was already at my sewing machine.
Okay, so I have my collar connected and then my interfacing for my buttons. I also went ahead and sewed on my clothing tab, although I should have sewed it on to just this layer before I sewed it down, but that's okay, I'll do that next time. I did also realize I forgot that the instructions for this collar have you understitch it before you stitch all of the linings in. So that is also in the instructions. It talks about it right here at number 18, understitching. It's okay that I didn't do that, but what understitching does is it takes all of your seam allowance from attaching all those layers together and sews it onto the lining so that it doesn't kind of bunch up where the collar is. So definitely would recommend you do that. I just forgot to do it as I was attaching the collar. And again, it's kind of one of those extra bonus steps, but it is very helpful. It's not the end of the world, so I'm just gonna leave it as is. So now I'm going to set my bodice aside and I'm going to start working on my sleeves. But so far, this is what we have for the bodice. It's starting to take shape and we have that lovely collar there. All right, so now it's time to sew the sleeve. And as a reminder, I adjusted and adapted the sleeve for this pattern. So this pattern comes with a short sleeve and then with kind of a quarter length sleeve. So this line right here would be the short sleeve, so like a cute little short sleeve poof. This line right here is a fitted quarter sleeve. It doesn't have any ruffles or gathers on the bottom of the sleeve. I just think that's such an awkward sleeve length. And I personally love my kind of oversized collar blouses to have a long sleeve. So what I did is I just measured from the top of my shoulder down to kind of past my wrist about an inch because I knew I wanted to have some kind of like little gather right there. And so extending that, I just, from the curves of this sleeve pattern right for the underarm, I just drew straight lines down, and then the center of my sleeve is the length from the top of my shoulder down to my wrist, and then I drew a straight line across. So what we're going to do is we're going to follow all of the regular steps for the sleeve that are in our pattern starting at number 27. But before I start following those instructions, I'm going to hem the bottom of my sleeves, and then I'm going to sew a stretched piece of elastic to create a ruffle. You could gather this by hand and sew a band into the bottom of the sleeve. You could do a sleeve similarly to what I'm wearing right now, but I personally like to just sew a stretched piece of elastic right above a hem, and it will bunch up and create a ruffle. So that is what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to go iron and pin the hem off camera. I will show you what that looks like. Then I'm going to go sew it, and I'm going to do my elastic. So my hem for this is just going to be about 1/4 of an inch hem. So I'm going to fold it up 1/4 of an inch and then another 1/4 of an inch. You could also serge the edge and then fold it up 1/4 of an inch, or you could do a rolled hem. Those are a lot of options. We just want to fold up the least amount of fabric possible.
And this is what the very narrow hem looks like at the bottom of my sleeves. As you can see, it is very, very tiny.
Okay, so instead of sewing a channel of bias tape to feed the elastic through, which you could totally do that, I like to take the quick and easy approach for adding elastic into a project to create some type of ruffle or add some kind of bunching or ruching by simply taking whatever length of elastic I want and stretching it as I sew it. Since this is for my sleeve and it's going to be around my wrist, what I usually just like to do is wrap it around my wrist to whatever tightness or looseness is comfortable. I obviously don't want this to be super loose, and it's usually best to fit it a bit tightly, since when you sew your elastic you're going to be stretching it. It usually ends up being a smidge stretched out. So I'm just going to wrap it around my wrist to kind of a snug fit, And then I'm going to cut that length of my elastic, and then I'm going to use that to measure a second piece and cut that. And then I'm going to figure out where I specifically want this elastic to be sewn. I kind of want my ruffle for these sleeves to really just be like an inch. So I'm going to use my ruler and just mark about an inch. And I'm going to draw a line here and all the way down, like so. Fun fact, if you get the erasable friction pins, they actually disappear when you iron them. So this is my favorite pin to use when I'm sewing, because rather than disappearing with air or with water, it literally just disappears when I go to iron it. So that line is where I'm going to be sewing my elastic. So I'm going to pin it at one edge, back stitch, and then I'm going to stretch it all the way to this end. And as I have it stretched, I'm going to sew along that line. So that is like my quickest, easiest little hack for adding elastic for bunching and ruching, or for a nice little ruffle on the ends of sleeves. So we're gonna do that to the second sleeve.
Alright, so now it's time to sew that bunched elastic onto the bottom of my sleeve to create that ruffle. So as you can see, and as I talked about before, I pinned one end of my elastic onto my sleeve and then the other end, and that allows me to stretch my elastic along the entire bottom of my sleeve as I'm sewing. So usually pinch in the middle of my elastic, stretch it, sew to the middle, and then I will stretch the other half of my elastic as I am going. So stretching the elastic as you sew creates this bunch where when you let go of your elastic, it bunches back together and it creates a ruffle without having to put elastic through a channel. So it's literally the best hack ever. After you sew your bunchy elastic, you are going to want to fold your sleeve in half, right side together, pin that long straight edge, which is your side seam, and sew that on a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Since I'm already at my sewing machine, I just folded it in half, right sides together, put some pins in, and I'm going to run a straight stitch down that side seam of my sleeve. After I sewed the side seam of my sleeve, I also took it over to my serger to finish those raw edges. You are going to want to finish your seams at this point as well in whatever method you choose. And here's what those sleeves look like with our bunchy, elastic, ruffly bottom and our side seams that are sewn and finished. At this point, you might want to flip your sleeves right side out. Doing so will get them ready for attaching them into your bodice, because you'll need them right side out then as well. Here's what that cute little ruffle looks like on my wrist. We are then going to go in and put our basting stitch, which is going to be used for gathers, along the top curve of our sleeves. And we are going to sew that basting stitch from the pattern dots that we transferred onto our fabric for where our basting stitch is supposed to be. Then once our basting stitch is placed into the top of our sleeves, we are going to just pull those and bunch them and gather them together so that the sleeve opening matches the armhole opening of our bodice. Then we are going to take our bodice and matching the right side of our bodice with the outside right side of our sleeve, we are going to match up the under seam of our sleeve and the side seam of our bodice. That's going to be our first matching placement and pin. And then we are just going to continue pivoting the curves of our armhole and our sleeve until we completely pin our sleeve into the armhole. You might have to do some adjustments on your gathers, loosening them or tightening them to make sure that your sleeve is inserted correctly into the armhole. But then once that adjustment is made, you are going to continue pinning along the top gather of your sleeve. And you're going to repeat those same steps for your second sleeve. And now it's time to sew our sleeve into our armhole. I actually removed the front kind of storage compartment of my sewing machine so that I could actually put my entire armhole over kind of the arm of my sewing machine, and this makes it a little bit easier to kind of just move that and pivot it around and underneath my needle.
Alright, so we have the sleeves attached now. So I also went ahead and finished those raw edge with the serger. If you don't have a serger, you can use pinking shears or you can use a zigzag seam finish. If you go to my classroom series, I have a couple of videos explaining and talking about different types of seam finishes you can do on your seam allowance outside of serging. I also have one on serging if you are new to that. So all of my inside seams are finished in whichever way you want. You are going to finish those. I attached the sleeves so you can see the gathers up here, and then you can also see the little stretchy ruffle that we have. So all that we have left to do is hem this shirt and do the button placement, button holes, and sew on the buttons. For the bottom of the shirt, you are going to double fold it. It's what the directions say. However, I prefer to do a very lazy hem where I will serge the edge and then all I have to do is fold it up one time. If you don't have a serger or you don't want to do that option, you can do a double fold, just really tiny, similarly to how we hemmed the bottom of our sleeves. You are going to do that all the way to where it's halfway underneath this interfacing. The reason for that being is that when we flip our interfacing out, it's going to be hidden underneath inside of that. So our interfacing kind of helps to fold that under. So what I'm going to go do is I'm going to take my iron and I'm going to fold this under and press it, and then I'm going to go stitch it all the way around. I could double fold this now since my interfacing already does that. That could be an option. But now we just have a hem to do, which is going to be really, really tiny. Just a single fold if you serge it, or you can do a double fold, just like that. And then the bottom of the shirt is also a little curved, so the hem is going to have some curvature to it.
Now that the ends of my bodice are pressed up, I'm just going to stitch those down for my hem. Again, if you didn't finish your edge with a serger and double folded it, you are still going to be doing the same stitch all the way around. It's a very narrow hem. I'm pretty sure my seam allowance was kind of at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And this is what it looks like, all nice and sewn. The last step of this bodice is the buttons and buttonholes. In your pattern, you're going to have a buttonhole placement, so you are going to want to make sure to correctly align that on the front edge of your bodice, and then I like to use an erasable or disappearing marker or pen to draw the lines for my buttonholes so that I know exactly where those are going to be placed. I'm using these pearly 5/8 inch buttons from Hobby Lobby, and you are also going to need to grab your buttonhole foot if your sewing machine has this. These are great because you just insert your button into the back and tighten it, and it automatically calibrates the size on your sewing machine.
Alright, so we're getting ready to sew the buttonholes. I have my buttonhole foot that I put on my sewing machine with the button in the back so that it automatically calibrates what size of buttonhole I'm going to make. I just have to make sure and pull this down right here, and then it will help my buttonhole foot go back and forth. And then I just set my sewing machine to the buttonhole size I want. I'm going to do number 50 for a square buttonhole. So I'm just going to change that number on my display screen, and my sewing machine will automatically calibrate the correct settings so that my foot will work.
My sewing machine has the capability to do an automatic buttonhole, which means that once I correctly set my machine up, I don't actually have to move my fabric because my sewing machine will bring it forward, backwards, and side to side to sew my buttonhole. If you have a sewing machine that isn't computerized, chances are it will be a manual buttonhole where you will have the same process of sewing, but you will have to actually move your needle. Once all of my buttonholes are sewn, it's time to trim any of the threads that are still there and then open up my buttonholes. Now I'm going to be opening my buttonholes with a seam ripper and a small pair of snippy scissors. There is like a buttonhole knife that is really handy, but I don't know where that is. It's still in storage right now, but a seam ripper works just fine. You just don't want to press it too hard and cut the other end, which is why towards the end of my buttonhole I use just the tip of this little pair of snippy scissors. And you're just going to repeat that process for all of your buttonholes. After your buttonholes are opened, you are going to want to fold the side of your bodice that has your buttonholes over the side of your bodice that you are going to be sewing your buttons. Match up the tops and the bottoms.
Alright, so now it's time for our button placement and sewing our buttons on. What I typically like to do is once I have my buttonholes sewn and opened up, I will just overlap the side of my blouse or my pants or wherever I have my buttonholes in over the side where my buttons are going to be placed. I want to make sure and match up the top of this blouse so that that button isn't all weird and funky, and then really make sure this is all smooth. And I will just go and I will put a circle inside that buttonhole for where I'm going to sew my button. And I've just felt like this has always worked for me, and then I know exactly where I'm going to sew it, and it's going to be all even for where all of my buttonholes are. So we go kind of check it, but you want to make sure that your buttons aren't on the edge of your fabric. You want them to be in a bit because this is going to overlap.
And then it's back to the old-fashioned technique of hand sewing, sewing on all of your buttons.
Alright, I'm just going to continue to do that same method for all the buttons up and down. Alright, we have completed the gorgeous giant collar blouse. Buttons are all sewn on, so I have to go film the reveal, but I wanted to chat about a couple of tweaks and hacks you could do to this blouse if you make it, depending on the style you want to go for. So a lot of large collar blouses that are really popular right now, I'll put some pictures up on the screen, tend to have more of an oversized kind of fit and feel, and I really like that. So when I was making this shirt, I actually didn't sew it to my exact size. I actually sized up multiple sizes. So this pattern that I have is size 8 through 16. Typically when I'm sewing anywhere from a size 10 to a size 12 because sewing patterns are standard sizing, and so I actually sew larger sizes when sewing than I'm going to purchase at the store. Anyways, it's a conversation for another day on women's fitting and sizing. But when I made this pattern, I cut everything to a size 12 except the side seams. The side seams I actually cut all the way to a size 16, which also meant that I had to cut the sleeves to a size 16, so I essentially sized up to the largest size, mainly because this pattern is a very kind of slim fitted blouse, and so I wanted to have that oversized effect. So when you make this, I suggest that you size up. So look at the measurement chart of the kind of finished garment sizing to see what fit you actually want to have. An additional thing, if I make this again, I'm definitely going to adjust this. I'm going to keep all of my sizing up, so cut everything still at a 16 for the sides, so I get that width. My shoulder, my neckline, all of that I kept at the size 12 that I usually sew. But next time I sew it, instead of doing the sides where I'm just cutting down the sides at the size 16, halfway down I actually want to angle it more and create more of a tent shape, and that would give this blouse a lot more of kind of a loosey flowiness, oversizedness, which I really think would kind of really hone in on that oversized fit of the large collar blouses that we tend to see. Another tip, which I also want to integrate next time that I sew this blouse, that I'm sharing it here with you, is that a lot of the blouses have kind of flowiness on the whole front bodice portion, and a lot of those have it because they will have like tucks, darts, little folds sewn along the shoulders or along kind of the chest area. And so when I do it again, I want to kind of add gathers to the shoulders to add flowiness across the whole front bodice. I've also thought about doing kind of the little folds and tucks sewn down. I'll try to put a picture if I can to show you what I'm talking about to that. So anyways, those are a couple additions. Make sure you size up if you want the oversizedness. If you want it to be more slim fitting like the original pattern, so your regular size, you can taper the sides out more to be angled and triangular, more of like a tent shape to give more flowiness. And you could also widen the shoulders for the front, gather them together, and then match them to the back so that you have more flowiness for the front. So a couple of ideas. Now let's go shoot the reveal so I can show you all the fabulousness of this bodice. And I'm wearing it with the pants that I made from the other side of this duvet cover. So it's kind of like a whole fun complementary matching set.
And here is the finished top. I absolutely love this pattern. One, because it's just so simple and easy to make, but this collar is so on point and it really is the most perfect blouse. I'm obsessed with the ruffles and the fun sleeves and just all of the details. I am going to be making so many more of these, and I hope that you try one out for yourself. If you do, make sure to tag me and share it with me so that I can see your own version of this and your creation. As always, thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure that you're subscribed to my channel and make sure to give this video a thumbs up if you liked what you saw today. I'll see you in the next video, and happy sewing!